So a new Second Amendment case has been granted review by the Supreme Court, and oral arguments have now been set. So let's talk about this critical case that the Supreme Court is now going to decide this term. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank our sponsor, Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, don't settle for an insurance company or the limitations that they put on your protection. AOR is backed by a real law firm, and it will offer you actual attorneys. Because of that, they will defend you and take your case potentially when other companies would not cover. If you acted in self-defense, AOR has your back, whether it's a good shoot, a gray area, or a more complicated situation, AOR will protect you. With AOR, you get a direct access to an attorney 24/7 who can give you immediate legal advice after a self-defense incident. This program includes no insurance bureaucracy, just real legal defense and actual attorneys. So if you're interested in protecting yourself and your family with the best self-defense coverage out there, check out AOR using my link down below in the detail section in the pinned comment, and also use code ARMSCHOLAR to get $50 off your individual sign-up or $25 off of a family plan if you want the family plan. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing one of the significant Second Amendment cases that has now been granted Supreme Court review, and now also oral arguments have been set in this case. The case we're going to be talking about in this video is Smith & Wesson versus Mexico. And in this case, a group of the largest firearms manufacturers, which include Smith & Wesson, Barrett, Century Arms, Colt, Glock, Ruger, and a ton of others, are now actually being sued by the nation of Mexico. Mexico is suing these companies in an attempt to hold them liable for harms that were caused by cartels in the nation of Mexico. And essentially they're claiming that these American companies are now liable for those criminal actions in a different nation. This whole case revolves around the PLCAA, also known as the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, and essentially whether or not the nation of Mexico and potentially others can sue American gun companies and hold them liable for third-party criminal conduct. This case is now one of the biggest cases that we have going right now in the Second Amendment community, and the Supreme Court has granted review to this case, and oral arguments have been set in this challenge. Now, this case made its way to the Supreme Court because the First Circuit Court of Appeals reversed a dismissal of this case. The Mexican government sued leading members of the American firearms industry, various gun companies, seeking to hold them liable for harms that were inflicted to the nation of Mexico and their residents and their citizens because of drug cartels. And they argue that these cartels used American-made firearms, that they made their way into the nation of Mexico. They were used by cartels, and essentially their argument is that the gun companies in America can be held liable for that criminal conduct. According to Mexico, these companies have engaged in a series of business practices for decades, from selling semi-automatic rifles to making magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. And essentially they argue that these companies in the US in large has failed to impose various sales restrictions and regulations on themselves. Mexico has sued these gun companies, and they claim that there has been around $238 billion in damages to the nation itself, and they are actually seeking $10 billion in compensation through this lawsuit, and they want those damages to be reimbursed. They also are asking for injunctive relief in the form of America itself imposing new gun control measures in the US and to essentially restrict the sale of AR-15s, AKs, and magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. So through this lawsuit, the nation of Mexico wants the Supreme Court and courts in general to impose gun control on the industry that is selling these items. Now, this case was originally filed and heard in a federal district court out in Massachusetts. Now, on review, the district court actually dismissed this case under the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. That means that the district court threw this entire lawsuit out at the lower court level because of the PLCAA. This is the type of lawsuit that the PLCAA essentially bars from happening and moving forward. However, Mexico then appealed that dismissal up to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. And on review, the First Circuit actually reversed the lower court's dismissal. The First Circuit held that the PLCAA does not bar this lawsuit because Mexico, in the First Circuit's eyes, stated a claim that the defendant's business practices have aided and abetted firearms trafficking to cartels in the nation of Mexico, and therefore there was a valid enough claim that in some ways got around the PLCAA. So in response to that, the companies now have filed for Supreme Court review. What the companies want is for the Supreme Court to find that the PLCAA does in fact prevent these types of lawsuits from even being brought and moving forward, and that the district court was correct in throwing this lawsuit out originally. In the petition, the question presented to the Supreme Court is whether the production and sale of firearms in the United States is the proximate cause of alleged injuries to the Mexican government stemming from violence committed by drug cartels in Mexico. And second, whether the production and sale of firearms in the United States amounts to aiding and abetting illegal firearms trafficking because firearms companies allegedly know that some of their products are ultimately unlawfully going to be trafficked into the nation of Mexico. Now, in their petition to the Supreme Court, the gun companies argue that Mexico's complaint does not include any groundbreaking factual revelations, nor does it uncover any secret dealings between the cartels and Americans' firearms companies. Instead, Mexico's suit challenges how the American firearm industry has openly operated in broad daylight for years. It faults the defendants for producing common firearms like the AR-15 and for allowing their production and for allowing the products to hold more than 10 rounds, and also for failing to restrict the purchase of those firearms and those magazines to regular citizens. In Mexico's eyes, continuing these lawful practices within the US amounts to aiding and abetting the cartels in Mexico. They go on to state that the PLCA precludes civil suits seeking to hold firearms companies liable for harm stemming from the downstream criminal misuse of their products, and it is nearly impossible to imagine a suit that is more clearly barred by the PLCA than this one here. The district court agreed, dismissing the case in full, but the First Circuit reversed. The First Circuit's decision cannot stand. It defies this court's precedent and creates an admitted split with a unanimous Third Circuit decision joined by then Judge Alito, as well as decisions in multiple circuits and state high courts. This court's review is warranted. The First Circuit's decision creates a direct and admitted split on proximate cause and brazenly defies this court's precedent on aiding and abetting. Both present important questions of federal law with serious implications well beyond the firearms industry, affecting every business whose products might be criminally misused downstream. The stakes of this case underscore why review is so needed. Absent this court's intervention, Mexico's multi-billion-dollar lawsuit will hang over the American firearms industry for years, inflicting costly and intrusive discovery at the hands of a foreign sovereign that is trying to bully the industry into adopting a host of gun control measures that have been repeatedly rejected by American voters. At the bottom, this case reduces to a clash of national values. Mexico makes no secret that it abhors this country's approach to firearms and that it wants to use the American court system to impose domestic gun controls on the United States that the American people themselves would never accept through the ordinary political process. So that's what's going on in this very important case. At stake in this lawsuit is whether or not the gun industry in the entire US can be sued into oblivion by maybe like the nation of Mexico or other nations who want to hold the firearms industry actually liable and hold them responsible for criminal misconduct that maybe happens in a different nation. But it also potentially could open the door for, people within the US to also sue the gun industry and try to hold them liable for other criminal misconduct that the gun company had nothing to do with. This also is an attempt by another nation like Mexico to try to impose gun control on the United States that the US has rejected. They want restrictions on AR-15s, semi-automatic rifles, and magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. And the nation of Mexico is actually trying to do that and enforce that on the US through this lawsuit. But now this attack on the Second Amendment will be reviewed by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has granted review to this case, and oral arguments in this lawsuit will take place on March 4th. So in just a couple months, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in this case, and it's going to be one of the more important Second Amendment challenges that we have going on right now. And that also means that before the end of their term, which is going to be, before July, usually the end of June is the latest that the Supreme Court will issue opinions. This term, the Supreme Court will issue a ruling on this important issue. So this is another huge Second Amendment case that we need to be watching going forward because this has broad-reaching implications for the entire, firearms community, for all gun companies, for everyone.